So do you want me to start? It's okay? Okay, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon and good evening for everybody. Welcome to this seminar, to the second session of this seminar. Thank you for joining us at the end of the semester. We are aware that it's a bit difficult. So when this seminar is language and neoliberal governmentality. With the publication in 2019 of our book, Language and Neoliberal Governmentality, we tried to open a debate about neoliberalism as a form of government, and also to approach what are the effects or the impact of this neoliberalism on our understanding of language, on our understanding of how power techniques function in relation to language, and also about the relation between neoliberalism and capitalism. So as the pandemic prevent us to fully engage in this discussion, we have organized this joint seminar organized by the Center for Applied Linguistics at the University of London, College London, and the MIRCo is a research center in Madrid. The meaning is Multilingualism, Discourse and Communication. And today's session, in this session, we approach language in society. And the session will be dealing with what is language in our work, how the vision of language is changing, and also the relation with society, that means with educations, with institutions, and so on. So today, moderator or convener is Eva Codó from the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. And she's going to introduce the session. So the session today. So Eva, you have the floor.
Thank you, Luisa, and thank you for inviting me to do this today, to moderate this event. I would like to welcome everyone following us, joining us from different parts of the world. The first thing that I'm going to do is introduce our speakers today. Some of you may know them, but just in case, okay, and I will follow the strict alphabetical order. So our first speaker is Professor David Bloch, ICREA Professor of Sociolinguistics at Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. We also have with us Dr. Alfonso del Percio from University College London, and who is also one of the editors of the volume that kind of has, driven this seminar series. Our third guest speaker is Professor Joseph Park from the National University of Singapore. And also with us, the author of the chapter that we will be discussing, Emerita Professor Bonnie Urciuoli from Hamilton College in the US. And as Lisa said, I will be moderating this event. I would like to begin by explaining a little bit how this is going to be organized. First, I will provide a short summary of the chapter, so, to introduce the discussion. Then we'll have different rounds of contributions and comments, and I will be also bringing new themes maybe to the discussion, and also bringing up some of the comments and questions that we've received from our audience, from participants that have sent you questions that they wanted to have raised in advance. Okay, this time we'll have a separate block for the chat. Okay, we encourage you all to use the chat to provide comments, just, express your reactions, questions. But we will deal with these comments or questions, concerns separately at the end. Okay, Luisa will be in charge of that block, okay? So we'll set some minutes apart for that. And we'll also ask our invited speakers to engage with the questions and comments that will have been posted in the chat, hopefully so. So we encourage you all to actually use the chat, but we will deal with your questions at the end. Okay, I hope this is clear. Yes, okay, so then I'm going to start with the summary of chapter 5 in the book on language and neoliberal governmentality, entitled Leadership Communication Skills and Undergraduate Neoliberal Subjectivity, by one of our guest speakers, as I said, Professor Bonnie Urciuoli. Okay, so in this chapter, Bonnie Urciuoli examines the discourse, the promises, and the nature of leadership communication training schemes. These are programs that are commonly offered as para-curricular workshops and seminars in US liberal arts education, but also more broadly. Specifically, she aims to understand what effects these programs have on student attendees' development of the promised skills and of the neoliberal subjectivities usually attached to them. However, she departs from the observation that this neoliberal inculcation is not very successful and wonders why it is important to be presented as if it were successful. Those of us who are familiar with Bonnie's work can clearly see the connections with the line of research that she's been pursuing over the last 2 decades. That is her work on the skillification of the self, that is the way in which workers, or what was called at the time, the new work order, no longer new, have been encouraged to think of themselves as bundles of skills. That is to imagine different aspects of their personality and their sociality as forms of behavior that are actually valued by the market because they contribute in significant ways to the productivity of an organization. And because of this contribution to the organization, they are seen to enhance the value of the individual worker that actually possesses these skills. Following this human capital logic, then workers are encouraged to continuously, work at upgrading their skills and actually enlarging the set of skills. And obviously the underlying idea is the assumption that these are forms of social behavior that are distinct, separable, trainable, and improvable. Now, in the chapter that we're using today as the basis for our discussion, not the focus, but the beginning of our discussion, Bonnie directs her gaze towards colleges and universities and how they're training students, in these seminars that are offered alongside the official curriculum to be seen, how they are seen as preparing them for the corporate world, where the skillification regime that we have just discussed is so prevalent. Now, she characterizes the rhetoric surrounding these programs as some sort of folk or pseudo register, where we have, we see these keywords being repeated over and again: leadership, change making, social innovation, entrepreneurship, and crucially communication skills, which are presented as the tools that will turn students into these leaders, innovators, and transformational change makers. What we see is that there is this imagined aspiring social template, a form of personhood, the leader, the entrepreneur, the innovator, that is promised to students as the outcome of these programs, and that the communication skills taught will help deliver independently of the actual content or the actual effectiveness of the program. So it's actually the promise that matters. It's the promise that somehow makes it real, makes these outcomes real. Then the chapter raises several questions in relation to the ways in which these communication skills are conceptualized. First, as Bonnie discusses, they are constructed as interactive skills with no formal linguistic discursive content. And secondly, whatever is required linguistically to be seen as acting as a leader, is ideologized as a skill and therefore susceptible to being scripted, technicized, in some ways also banalized, converted into a set of exercises, included in a teaching guide that can be delivered by maybe administrators in a way that is content independent and context independent. Bodies ethnography show, shed light on how and why then college students engage with these programs. And we get to see how it's mostly because it's a requirement actually of the grants and the scholarships that many of these students, many of whom are actually diverse students of color, have received from some of the organizations that actually kind of organize these programs. She also discusses then how little is actually achieved in terms of any significant ability development on the part of the students beyond, and that is observed beyond a clear alignment with institutional aims, that is with the discourses and the practices of leadership, communication, training. And so it is there that we can see the process of neoliberal subjectification operating, that is in the fact that students actually do play the game, the institutional game. They follow formats, they deliver exercises, that somehow, and I'm quoting her words, that's something approximated the expected performance. Okay, they make the effort, they are there, and as for the institutions, what they sell is their concern and alignment with the corporate need for a certain type of student worker, which by virtue of these seminars, they create the illusion of producing. And this is one of the reasons why these programs are presented as successful, to be seen as creating this type of student workers. So this is my summary for today. This is obviously my own take on the chapter, and the chapter can take us and will take us hopefully in many different directions. So what I'm going to do today is ask guest speakers to react to the chapter in the way they think fit. And I'm going to begin with reverse alphabetical order this time. So our first speaker then will be Professor Urciuoli, who happens to be also the author. So when you're ready, the floor is yours.
You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Eva, Professor Codó. Thank you so much for that wonderfully precise summary. That was very much what I was trying to get at. And I'm going to add a few things later when we're responding to comments. I realized in the years since I published the chapter how much at the time I didn't put together how much that was what I want to call it, sort of neoliberal theater. But I'll come back to that. So let me start, as I requested, I was asked to put together a few minutes about how some of these new theoretical approaches to language that we've been talking about and economy and forms of governments advance our understanding of language and society. And so I just scribbled down a few points so I don't waste too much time here. First of all, I want to talk about how the classification and codification of any set of discursive practices, when it's put together as something definable as a package, you always have to think of that as a process that points to, indexes, the interests and motivations of whoever's doing the packaging. And, in a large-scale society that has various forms of institution of inscription and enforcement, regulation, and so forth, it's fairly easy to find something to point to, but I think this is a general principle in any society, because the codification and, it favors the interests of those who are in a position to do it. And this is, we've long realized this is true of sets of language forms. And as work most notably work of Deborah Cameron, I think, has pointed out, this is also true of discourse practices that are not necessarily formalizable, although there is this fiction that they can be formalized. So these codifications may or may not reflect what people actually do. And I think what's key is the association of forms or practices with the typifications of people doing it. And that's one of the key points about enregisterment that people like Asif Agha have pointed out. Next, such codification or classification takes place within dynamics along a whole range of scale, or as we generally talk about, in a larger set of structures. And so it's those structures and who is operating in them and sort of the distribution of power in a Foucauldian sense that is what indexed, but you have to know how to look for that indexing. So that's why ethnography is so important. In the world that we live in, economic structures and dynamics loom very large, hence, our concern currently with neoliberal order. Although it's worth remembering that for much of the history of the world and for most places in the world, that wasn't the case. So the very fact that we look at it now as part of a larger order, I think not everyone, but a lot of people tend to talk about it as if that's a permanent state of things, but it's worth remembering how much all this is in flux. And for example, as a lot of work by Monica Heller and people associated with, that line of work have pointed out, what we call the neoliberal order operates in shaping language along with other orders that have been around for a considerable amount longer, like colonial orders, let's say. And in fact, they're all intertangled. A primary function of such codification is that they limit and discipline. And that explains the connection of discourse form or practice to the typification of users. So the idea is how the typified user is seen to fit in or not fit in, and in what ways and to what degrees. And I think this matters a great deal more as a social function than how, quote, accurate such typifications and associations are, or whether what the typified are supposedly using, whether they even do what's attributed to them. So that's focus on the pseudo register attributed to these student leader change makers by these allegedly educational, and I mean allegedly educational outfits like Ashoka and Posse, which are private organizations that are out to make money. And they exist through corporate contributions. The students themselves are less important as users than they are as exemplars of value that such outfits want their corporate donors and other consumers of their services to see. It's starting to sound like Facebook. And I think colleges and universities are part of this theater. And just as it may not matter that students do or do not use such practices, it doesn't matter how much students internalize that neoliberal governmentality. What matters more is that they occupy a role that says governmentality can be internalized. Try to keep an eye on time here. Because that's what's being sold. So in an older era, codifying information through universities and royal academies, I think we're also pushing forms of government. And governments, last point, governance operates as a metasemiotic regime or set of rules about what should be. And what probably matters most is how or how much people act like they've internalized that regime and what can be done to them if they act like they have not. And I think a lot of the regulatory functions of, how language is regulated so the regulatory functions of institutions that regulate language are really less, they look like they're about enforcing having language a certain way, but what they're enforcing is the limits on who's allowed to do what. I think that I'm going to leave it there because I've gone on for a bit. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. I think the next in line is Joseph Park.
Yes, first I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thanks to Alfonso, Luis, and Laura for inviting me. And of course, thank you to Bonnie for the very insightful article. Yeah, so I mean, this really made me think about various issues. I was reading this chapter, of course, all other chapters in the edited volume as well. But to just to kind of sum up a couple of points, I guess, you know, one thing really kind of made me think about is how the question of how far-reaching is neoliberal governmentality, right? So in this case, I mean, I guess to me, the most interesting point, the observation is that these students participating in these programs don't really always show close alignment with the neoliberal ideals. And the program itself doesn't seem to be designed in a way that always kind of pursues these kind of neoliberal values kind of explicitly, right? But of course, Bonnie's point is that nonetheless, there is simply the structure and the organization and the roles that people are supposed to play in this process, nonetheless kind of leads to this kind of effective governmentality. But at the same time, I think it's an interesting kind of case because it does illustrate how the reach of neoliberal governmentality is not necessarily all-encompassing. And I say this because in contrast to many other studies on neoliberalism, language and neoliberalism, I guess there's tendency to kind of emphasize how neoliberalism really kind of reaches and how effective it is, right? So in my own work, for example, I think I tend to emphasize that aspect, right? So how the neoliberal language policies and neoliberal practices tend to get really internalized and picked up by participants in a very active way. But obviously, it's not the case that people always align themselves all the time with these neoliberal principles, right? So even when they're not necessarily explicitly resisting such principles, simply because of the fact that their lives are, you know, embedded in, you know, specific material realities, and these practices have to be mediated with the people's own conduct, there's always some space for leakage, right? So people not completely aligning with these principles and so forth. So I think that should be a kind of obvious fact, but I guess it's not something that's always emphasized and clarified in ethnographic research on such cases. And I think that Bonnie's chapter was very insightful in kind of reminding me of that fact and thinking about what that means a little bit more deeply. So for example, I mean, can these kind of leakages can be considered some opportunities for resisting or, you know, contesting these ideas of neoliberalism, right? And what exactly is the role of language in creating and, you know, maintaining such leakages, right? So because language itself is always kind of dynamically embedded in social life, right? It never gets subsumed under a single function, even when we try to put it into use in a particular way, right? So likewise, the kind of use of language and discourse in the context of various studies, how does that open up the space for such leakage of neoliberal governmentality? Mm-hmm. So that was kind of one, the most kind of salient point for me. Kind of another idea that, another kind of thought that came to me in relation to that is about the ideas of these different types of skills, right? So I think it's quite interesting that the chapter points out how the so-called leadership skills and communicative skills are kind of presented as if it's something concrete, but actually, you know, when you look at closely and how it is taught and kind of explained or accounted for in these programs, such descriptions are very vague, right? So, you know, and that kind of contrasts, for example, in other cases where people talk about, for example, again, in my own work, for example, we talk about these skills as skills in a specific language, for example, you know, picking up English as a kind of a communicative skill, as a neoliberal subject must have, or something like that. So in this case, are we talking, would you want to say that acquisition of particular language for neoliberal purposes versus acquisition of communicative skills, which might be something much more vague? Should we treat them as something different, or kind of focus more on the fact that this packaging of these different aspects of communication in terms of skills, should we approach that more as an ideological construct to begin with, right? So if we step aside from a more structural linguistic point of view, I believe for example, the more structural aspects of language, as has been kind of focused on traditional linguistics, versus kind of more communicative skills as a mediator of social relations, is not necessarily something distinct, right? So for example, in classical social linguistic work, there's always been lots of emphasis on using the grammatical resource of language in a wrong way can lead you to be seen as a person who does not have the right aptitude or, you know, preparedness for a particular job, for instance, right? So, you know, who gets to decide who gets to decide what counts as a different, a distinct skill, and how does such models of skills stand up if you compare it to the kind of more dynamic social embeddedness of language and communication? That's another issue that kind of came to my mind as I was reading, and it kind of made me think more deeply about those topics. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think it's Alfonso's turn to provide your contribution to your reaction to the chapter.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. Yeah, I mean, my contribution is echoing a little bit what has been said so far. I mean, for me, this text is inspiring. I think Bonnie, your text is for me also programmatic and forces us to raise a couple of questions and also to think forward, right? So what comes next? What do we know, and what maybe don't we know yet, right? So basically, it provoked three sorts of questions, and the first one is definitely about language. So the question I think that I want to ask myself, and I think it would be important to just raise is what is the status and the nature of language in this apparatus of control, regulation, and oppression? So is there a way of saying more about this? And I think that Bonnie Urciuoli's text is providing a lot of answers to this. I think we have just also because of the tradition of the field of sociolinguistics, we focused a lot on, you know, how are these apparatuses of control regulating language and language skills and standardizing them and imposing specific norms to us. And I just wonder whether there's more and to that. So whether the study of governmentality and neoliberal governmentality in particular, you know, forces us to go beyond that. And I think that the study of registers, I mean, that Bonnie has put forward in the last decades is a very important aspect, because it forces us to show or to study language not as a language, but the entire package, right? So how language comes with specific persona type, and how, so the regulation is not just maybe what we speak and the way we speak, but also what kind of persona we are expected to be. And then I was also thinking that maybe another aspect where we could find language is in the production of these rationalities. So these bodies of expertise, these texts, these genres, which circulate these neoliberal, I mean, which mediate these neoliberal rationalities, right? And then at the same time to look at how these technologies of self, these CDs, all these scripts, these templates, how they are also manifested, or how they are mediated and or materializing into language. So not just their regulation. So what I'm learning from this text is that maybe we shouldn't look at just the regulation of the way we speak and what we speak, but also how these kind of rationalities get produced and how they materialize in specific technologies of the self. And then so maybe the last part, which we already kind of discussed a bit last time, was also to think more about how these rationalities, these neoliberal rationalities, kind of get normalized, naturalized, and circulated through everyday practices. So I wonder whether we should reactivate in a way or in another a more interactional ethno-methodologist approach, but which is really kind of which really thinks in terms of the implementation of a hegemony through everyday practices. So I think that in terms of we as language scholars, we can really make a big contribution to the study of neoliberal governmentality, and to really kind of highlight its communicative nature in a way. So the second kind of thought that I had was around, I mean, what is the status of, what are the status of these workshops and also of these technologies of government that they kind of vehiculate within the larger, let's say, neoliberal project, right? How can we understand these workshops that Bonnie is documenting and these technologies of power and the self as serving in a way social stratification and as perpetuating or contributing to the perpetuation of the social conflict, right? So I think what Bonnie is inviting us to do, or what kind of, so this is how I'm reading, is really to look at what are these technologies doing, what are they doing, and what are they about, and what are they doing with whom, right? Because here it is clear. So what is interesting is that maybe they are not so much about kind of inculcating a specific register into people's mind, but one aspect that I found interesting is also to create distinction between these different programs, right? So a kind of appealing program needs to include this sort of stuff to kind of differentiate itself from other kind of program sponsoring working class, racialized undergrad students. So maybe the objective is actually not to inculcate, or it seems that it's not doing that, but rather to create distinction. And in this case, In other cases, it's maybe not the case, right? So really maybe to be more careful and thinking about what are the effects, what makes that specific registers are taken up by whom and with which consequences. So, and how is this kind of anchored within the conflict that we are all kind of living in? I mean, within a society that is deeply divided, and how are these workshops and trainings in a way contributing to the perpetuation of this divide? Yeah, and then the last question that I was just asking myself is, where do we situate our critique? So what is our critique? And how do we respond to the discomfort that these techniques of government are producing in us? And then I was thinking, okay, and then how do we avoid, maybe, if you want, that our critique will produce nostalgic imaginations of a past which maybe was not as equal as we want it to be, right? So what do we do with our discomfort, and how do we move on with that? So what kind of alternative imaginations of language and of workerhood in this case can we put forward? Where do we situate our critique, and then how do we respond to that? So these are a bit the kind of reactions that this text provoked in me.
I was making notes actually. Thank you. Thank you, Alfonso. David, the last reaction.
Yeah, I had some notes about what I wanted to say, and then I've just been listening to what other people are saying. So maybe I'll do a kind of a fusion. And thank you, Bonnie, also for opening up with the comments you made about your chapter and extending on that. I've read quite a bit of Bonnie's work over the last few years, and I've even read another one or two pieces, I think, about this study. So I found it, I find it all very interesting. Looking at, something that Alfonso was mentioning about this, there's, and I think everybody's mentioned in a way, there's this whole issue about, uptake in a way. Use a term maybe from another field like second language acquisition. And, we know that we can never assume that what is taught is learned, and in fact, quite the contrary in many cases. And so this whole question, that came up at the end of the chapter, there was a question posed in one of the last paragraphs, do students internalize a neoliberal subjectivity? Well, first of all, we'd have to maybe go back and unpack what is a neoliberal subjectivity, but I won't be boring and go into that. But how would we know anyway? I think Bonnie was hinting at this in her comments earlier. People live their lives in multiple contexts, and we could even go to the notion of kind of multiple identities, that we have in these different contexts. So how do we actually know, and what do we take into consideration what the students sort of bring with them into these courses? Of course, there's also the possibility, as we discover in many educational contexts, that this is all sort of a pantomime, that it is maybe Alfonso was hinting at this, and I think it came up in an earlier comment, that, this is just being done as sort of going through the motions. We need to do something. Maybe the university looks good if it's primarily an elitist university, if it has working class kids coming through these programs. So that's sort of another factor in that whole question, do students internalize? Well, maybe that was, maybe that wasn't the plan. The plan is really just kind of to very superficially run a program that looks like it's doing something. That's more cynical approach, really. But going back to what I was saying, how do we separate, the whole issue of the way people behave in their day-to-day lives, and then do we really identify different behaviors as that's neoliberal, that's inflected by neoliberalism, and that behavior isn't? So nobody is talking in those simplistic terms, but I think those are sort of questions maybe to ask. How would we know it? This idea of internalization of this neoliberal subjectivity. I was interested also in the mention of Dewey, kind of bringing the kind of experience, educational experience, was kind of a backdrop to all of this, and kind of a tradition in the United States. And also Veblen mentioned for his, critiques 120 years ago of university, or over a century ago, I should say, of university in the United States, the collusion, so to speak, between the business community and the university. And of course, this after Veblen, many other people have commented on that. And of course, in the times that people are looking at calling neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, the current version of global capitalism, quite a few books are coming out. Very interesting book from, I think, John Smith out of Australia a few years ago, The Toxic University, which is quite interesting, and talking about the quantification of everything that academic staff do, and indeed how this sort of extends to the students. So I think there's another couple of things I'd mention. I mean, I was reminded, nobody's mentioned so far, but everybody has on their mind this whole, Foucault's notion of grids of specification, and the whole notion of a gaze, if you like. So to the extent to which there's a gaze, projected onto these students, that they should be particular types of people, if you like. And that leads me to, going back to sort of connecting with the notion of uptake, whether the students don't seem to be aligning with the values, behaviors, and more specifically linguistic behaviors that are coming through in these courses. What are the kind of responses that people have? And of course, there's been a lot written about the notion of resistance, if you like. But of course, resistance is a term I think of, as do a lot of people such as Giroux and others, that you need to think about the effect of actions, and resistance in a way only an action counts as resistance if it's taken as such, if you like, by the elements being resisted. Otherwise, it could just be seen as something oppositional, but it doesn't really have an effect on power that's underlying the actual actions or behaviors of others that are being resisted. And of course, other responses could be, sort of acquiescence, kind of more passive, I'll just go along with this, or even sort of a wholehearted sort of acceptance, really an engagement with. And I suppose that's what the program designers, no doubt have in mind, assuming we don't take the cynical approach I mentioned earlier, that they realize it's all pantomime. But let's say that they, really want these students to come on board. The other thing beyond that is if the students, if we imagined, an ideal sort of educational scenario, not my ideal scenario, but let's say an ideal scenario for some people, students come to class, they learn all of these behaviors, the skill sets, and then they go out in the, kind of the real world, the job market, and then they're hired. And, and then down the road, 10 years later, you go into the company where they work, and there they are, doing it, sort of reproducing all of this stuff all over again, and maybe even training other people to do the same. But of course, the other thing, going back to class differences, and, when people come into a university, what they bring with them and how much they are, looking at some of Bourdieu's work and other people who've looked at universities, who fits in and who doesn't. And we could bring in the concept of belonging here, sort of a sense of belonging. What sense of belonging do these students have anyway to the university they're attending? And of course, if they go out into the business world coming through these courses, what sense of belonging would they have? But belonging depends, and this is something I've been working on recently, is sort of there are at least 2 or 3 other notions connected to that. One is authentication, from the work of Mary Buchholz going back a few years. So people need to be authenticated in order to be accepted into a group. And whether we look at groups in terms of some sort of notion like communities of practice or some other theory, there is kind of a process. You need to be authenticated if you're gonna be able to effectively belong to a group. And of course, countering that is the stigma, looking at Goffman's work, that these students might carry with them in the university at large. And then, when they leave the university and go out into the job market, they carry with them some form of stigma, right? That stigma could be having to do with behaviors that they don't quite, have the whole package that middle-class kids would have. And even going to university hasn't brought everything to them. And there's quite a bit of literature on that kind of thing, of people carrying through life certain sort of, the whole notion of the kind of subtle injuries of class, if you like, going back to Sennett and Cobb's work. So I think that's another kind of angle on this, I think. And I suppose I'm thinking in terms, I mentioned identity earlier, also in terms of, through the door of Bourdieu and Habitus, or Derek Lader's work on psychobiography, what kind of predispositions are these students bringing in? And then is this an attempt really to kind of remold their habitus or their psychobiography in such a way that they, they come on board. And I think that's about all. There were a couple of other things. I mean, we could get into all kinds of issues, like I mentioned earlier. Say neoliberalism is a term that's thrown around, but really that's not the important point. And so, hold on one second. Let me just see here. Yeah. No, I won't say anything. I was going to say something like the codification. Come back to that. So I'll just stop there and let's open it up, I suppose, at this point. I don't know what happens, but thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you all. And there were so many interesting threads in, that we could pursue in your contributions that it's very difficult to pick up on one, actually. So I'd like to link up with, I think, most of the contributions. David was just mentioning issues of class and race. And I think the four contributions have addressed also the issue of the partial alignment. Yeah, and Joseph was talking about the leakages that we see. Bonnie was talking about how the neoliberal order articulates with other orders. And so the fact that this is not a totalizing rationality, obviously not, and this is clear in the chapter that we are basing our discussion on. Bonnie was also saying how it's not so important whether this the neoliberal rationality is actually inculcated, but the fact that students have to come across as if they have internalized this rationality. And Alfonso, along the same lines, was asking, okay, so what are these programs doing? Alfonso, you were talking about perpetuating social conflict, perpetuating inequalities. So my question now, to move the debate forward a little bit, would be touching upon issues of social class, race, and gender, maybe age. How do these dimensions play out in these alignments, non-alignments, partial alignments, engagements with neoliberal rationalities in the plural? Whoever wants to react to that. Bonnie, you have to unmute, I think.
There, I've been trying to unmute, it kept muting again. Would you like me to address that, or Joseph or David or Alfonso? Would any of you like to? No? Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, let me just say, sort of to start things off, if I understood your question correctly, you're asking about how classifications according to gender, class, race affect the construction of a neoliberal subject. Can I interpret it that way?
Or people's engagement with it, with the, actors' engagement with the neoliberal order, the neoliberal regime, and the sanctions attached to maybe not engaging with it.
Well, all right. One of the things that, I don't know how neatly it breaks down along any classifications, but I think I want to try to answer it from a different angle, if that's okay. One of the things that always struck me about the way in which the construction of a desired neoliberal notion of subjectivity is promoted by, let's say, the corporate world. First of all, I want to start by saying something that's kind of sounds like it's coming in from nowhere, but I've been thinking about it a lot. And that is, I'm more and more thinking that the sort of discourses of neoliberalism play out from one corporate entity to another. And actors as individuals, we're just content providers. More and more I'm thinking of this, in social media kind of modeling. And so I think what's happening is that the message that's being sent, whether to students, potential employees, to anybody, is to go back to the diversity training manuals that were written in the 1990s, really, and even earlier, is that you, the individual, are, you're this bundle of properties, and distinctions of whatever defines you as a human being. You should be rethinking of them as, in market terms, and that's what we value about you. But it's not really, and this is kind of what I wanted to say in answer to your question, it's not really gender as we as actual living human social actors experience gender or experience class or experience race or experience any dimension of unequally distributed social value. Rather, it's like this little costume that you're supposed to put on and perform. And so the work that I did at, on students at this college, students got pretty good at sort of playing that role. And I saw various venues in which they did that, sort of personally and through media that was then projected by the school, where, they're, wearing bits of their classification as, bits of neoliberal value. But then, you talk to them and they're like, yeah, I have to do that. Or they say, maybe it'll give me an edge. I don't see them necessarily, buying that, but I don't know if I answered your question at all. Sorry.
Oh, no, don't worry at all. I don't know who was first, David or Alfonso. David, you want to go first?
Okay. No, I was just thinking of and what Bonnie's saying now. Let's look at class issues here. We're looking at university students. Yeah. So independent of their background, they're propelled into a universe which is we could define as much more middle class, and certainly at least traditionally, we've looked at universities as a way of sort of means to which people attain social mobility, and we all know that social mobility has sort of come to a grinding halt in many sectors, but still. Going to an elite university, for example, that does propel you into a different universe. And it's useful to look at these. Gerson's work was mentioned, Ilana Gerson's work, where the kind of sociological work where people just talk to people who are out in the job market. And there's older studies such as Lois Weiss, but really interesting work by Jennifer Silva looking at I think she was in Massachusetts doing the research and looking at working class communities on 2 occasions. There are 2 books by her in roughly 2013 and 2019. So one is kind of an initial study, and then there's kind of a follow-up. And she's looking at working class people from a lot of different backgrounds. Actually, I think there are more geographical locations involved. I'm trying to remember now. But what struck me reading about her material is the extent to which, and this cut across, she was very careful to get a kind of a diversity in terms of race and ethnicity and a kind of gender balance. And you were getting a lot of people really putting it all on themselves, So, I started a small business, it went bankrupt. And, and sort of incorporating a lot of this, if you like, neoliberal vocabulary, but having internalized it. She wasn't, putting it out there. They were coming at her with a lot that looked about, self-responsibility, individualization of society that we see. These people were sort of manifesting all of this through their comments. And I found that quite interesting. In fact, the notion of, oh, I blame the government, or I blame somebody else. No, there wasn't. There was much more. I take responsibility, for what my actions, and I failed here, and I should have done better. any effect talking to the researcher, okay, we could factor that in maybe, but I thought that was a very interesting point. And in fact, what comes through Jennifer Silva's work is this kind of that people have incorporated these kinds of ways of seeing the world far more than a lot of us might want to think, or possibly it's a question of having access, you know, to people working in, you know, say still working in factories, or working sort of working class jobs, if you like, or trying to start small businesses. So I thought that was a interesting thing. It kind of connects what I said earlier. So what people, we could look at one particular program at a university, but what happened before? Where were these students before? And what kind of influences had they been exposed to? And what kind of, above all, what kind of sort of habitus have they developed around the whole notion of education, but self-responsibility, and, you know, their prospects of upward mobility. And that would be an interesting thing to know about, obviously, coming into the time of program. But as I said, these other studies I mentioned throw up some very, very interesting issues around, you know, whether people can be seen as having incorporated this notion of the kind of neoliberal subject, for lack of a better word. That's all. Sorry.
Thank you, David. Alfonso?
Yeah, I think that my answer in a way kind of echoes already a bit what has been said so far. I think we really need to see this in terms of governmentality. So the management of social inequality, right? So we live in a society which is structured around racial, gender, class differences, right? And we live in conflict. So capitalism produces differences, hierarchies, stratification, which are organized around these differences, right? And I think that these workshops, but also kind of other kind of oppressive regulatory practices that colleagues have documented, are attempts to manage and in a way, if you want, to reproduce this conflict among gender, race, class types of persons. And I think what is important, because I mean, Bonnie just mentioned before colonialism. I do think that in a way, if we put it in terms of governmentality, not just neoliberal governmentality, we can see that this is it's just the last, or maybe not even the last step of a longer history of attempts to manage capitalism. Okay, so what we have here is, of course, an attempt to manage capitalism and the conflict and the inequalities that capitalism produces through a logic of freedom. Okay, and then that speaks to different types of people in different ways, right? While I think that for certain people type, like, I mean, well, the type of people that I'm working with, it's basically an attempt to manage their affect and their anger. For other people, it may work, right? And that somebody who has an aspiration to become a manager in a big corporation, it may even make sense, right? In other cases, like here, we have really, I think it's, I mean, maybe it's cynical, David, but it's really a logic of distinction among universities who are also competing within a larger kind of education industry. So I really think we need to understand this as an attempt to manage capitalism and its effects, its social effects. And manage here is not to produce equality, but rather to actually reproduce inequality. And this really needs to be understood as in a historical continuity. And it's just the last instance of a longer story. For example, a story of how do we produce workers, right? And how do we manage workerhoods and labor inequalities. So in that sense, I think it's as if we need to see all these differences that you mentioned, Deva, in a way together to understand what this thing is about and what it is meant to do, right? And it has then different effects on all these kind of people type, persona types. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Alfonso. Yeah.
If I may add on what Alfonso was saying. So I absolutely agree with that. And I guess a kind of another way of kind of flip side of looking at that is kind of neoliberal rationality in a way cannot help but kind of draw upon those categories of inequality at the same time. Even when it's not explicitly, I guess, focused on reproducing such inequalities, because it kind of is focused on managing and reproducing these orders of capitalism. In a way, it has to really draw from those categories and differences that were fundamental to the kind of establishment of, and kind of maintenance of capitalism, right? So, so in the cases that Bonnie was talking about, the programs themselves might focusing on diversity by inviting, racial minorities and kind of lower socioeconomic class students, but nonetheless, in kind of constructing the ideal model of the university student and neoliberal worker, they cannot help but draw from models of personhood that are built upon these ideal kind of racialized, perhaps white and middle class kind of people, right? So in my study of kind of diversity management in a kind of multinational corporation, for example, even as these multinational corporations always kind of emphasized these aspects of cultural and linguistic diversity, ultimately the ideal kind of worker that is able to blend in well with this culture of diversity management is supposed to be the kind of Western kind of white English speaker. And even when the ideal subject is not, actual white native English speaker themselves, the ideal model that they're aiming for and the specific practices that were considered to be ideal were often aligned with those specific racialized models, for instance, right? So it's almost as if the basic imagination of diversity itself is already constrained by those racialized and class-based categories to begin with, right? And that's perhaps not surprising because it is, we're talking about an order that has been really shaped out of the capitalist system itself, which has been built upon those inequalities.
Thank you. Are there any other reactions to this, or shall I bring up another maybe theme to discuss? Okay, so I'd like to go back to something that was said in the first round of contributions, and that is the issue of language. And this is also a comment that came from our audience. Joseph was talking about how we need to understand better how language works in creating and maintaining the neoliberal rationalities. And Alfonso was also talking about, so Alfonso was giving us some ideas how to proceed in that research agenda. And he was mentioning how we need to focus, put a sharper focus on the study of registers, on how the neoliberal rationalities are naturalized in everyday practices. So my, the theme that I'm bringing to the conversation now is, okay, what are the blind spots? What is it that we need to understand about the articulation of language and neoliberal governmentality that we haven't addressed yet in a way that is productive, that allows us to see things that we haven't seen so far? that we haven't analyzed so far. So. Sorry, I hope that wasn't too complex a question to answer.
Perhaps can I start?
No, Joseph, go
okay.
ahead.
Oh, sorry. Bonnie, were you going to start first, or?
I can wait.
Okay, all right.
Joseph,
Well,
thanks.
I kind of already mentioned this in my first comments, but I guess one thing that at least what I take as challenge for myself is to really question, kind of look back at my own assumptions of language and are my ability as a linguist to distinguish between different aspects or levels of language. So for example, distinction between, language as a named structural variety versus language as a communicative skill, for instance, right? So I guess, lots of us are trained to see those as totally different aspects of language to begin with, based on kind of structuralist principles. But I mean, in a way, what contributes to this kind of working of language within neoliberalism is such fragmentation of communication into these compartmentalized parts, right? Language as structure versus, particularized language as skill, or kind of different types of skills and so forth, right? So, so sometimes I feel a deeper challenge of our own assumptions about those different levels and different organization categories of language itself. Perhaps that is something that we need in order to identify points of collusion between our own linguistic analysis and neoliberal workings of neoliberalism, or kind of finding new points where we might critique the way language gets embedded in these neoliberal projects. I'm not sure if that was clear enough, but that's one point that I was thinking about.
Lovely, thanks. Bonnie?
I was basically going to say a version of what Joseph just said. So Joseph, thank you for saying it. I was just now thinking, as a linguistic / semiotic anthropologist, whatever the hell I am, how would I describe language? And it's like, well, it's what people do when they communicate to each other. And, it's got all these dimensions, which, we've all, paid attention to in various ways. And as soon as we start nailing it down beyond that, I think it raises the question of in whose interests is this process of nailing it down? And I just want to give this little example. About 30, when I was writing my dissertation, so let me see, I did my field work for my dissertation 1978, 79. So I was writing my dissertation, and after that, I won't say how long it took. And I was writing about Puerto Rican bilingualism on the Lower East Side in New York City, and how that, there's all this, racial and class ideology embedded in the people that I worked with and their perceptions of bilingualism. And I should say also 1988. So in the early, in the early 80s, when I was trying to write my dissertation based on my first field work, and I was trying to get a handle on what it was that people thought they were doing. And when they would try to typify language to me, and it would be in their perception of, sort of popular categories of what language was. Everybody here has done some variety of work with, these kinds of multilingual situations, super diverse, whatever you want to call it, these situations of language flux. And so we're all acquainted with how hard it is to nail it down. And people would, my, informants, respondents, whatever you want to call them, were not, these were people that if they made it through high school, they were doing pretty well, but they thought about it. They really, were aware of the discrepancies between the set of practices that they did and how it got classified. And we used to talk about that a lot, which is what eventually led to, my, what became the book, Exposing Prejudice. Anyway, the point I wanted to make is one of the absolutely key elements of their perception of themselves as being able to draw resources from what gets classified as English and Spanish is the way in which they were sensitive to what they called tune or tone, tone of voice. And, I tried to figure out how the hell to write about this. And I was very clumsy about it. And I don't think I ever did a very good job with it. And it was very, very hard to describe. All right, so fast forward, I'm at a conference. I'm talking to a guy named Pedro Pedraza, who was a graduate student in the 70s of William LaBeouf at Penn. And Pedro was doing work on bilingualism in New York. And so we got talking about how the hell do you describe this phenomena? And he said, well, let me tell you a story. He said, when I was trying to write my dissertation, I was trying to figure out what do you do with this element of tune or tone that people talked about, which was a very central part of sort of ethno-linguistic recognition among people we were working with. And he said, and I talked to LaBeouf about it, and he said, well, it won't fit into a variable rule formula, so can't really do anything with it. And Pedro said, but it's central to what people think they're doing. It's like, well, yeah, but you can't really describe it. So it's, and of course the question that raises is, do you say there's elements of the experience of language, which we just don't have good apparatus to work with, but maybe at some point somebody will figure it out. Or do we say that doesn't fit into the definition of language? And I think that we got to sort of keep that in mind when we think about the way in which perceptions and definitions of language get controlled by whatever agencies are defining it. They kind of ran on, but I was just trying to get to this question of what the hell is language? Anyway, done.
Thank you. Alfonso, your turn.
Yeah, I was just thinking while I was listening to you and that, you see, maybe it's an empirical question. Maybe it is an empirical question, what counts as language within this kind of neoliberal governmentality, because especially in linguistic anthropology, but also in the broader language sciences, we have a lot of work thinking about how, modernity and the invention of the modern state, if you want, the invention of capitalism, necessitated a specific understanding and imagination of language and what counts as language and what not, and how language kind of served the kind of perpetuation of these political and economic projects. So maybe the question I'm just thinking aloud. So maybe the question is not necessarily what do we think language is, but rather what do these actors who do neoliberal governmentality think that language is, right? So for example, Ilana Gershon was just a couple of weeks ago So we had a joint panel where she was kind of putting forward this idea that maybe we need to think in terms of neoliberal or economic genres, right? So that this kind of mode of regulation and oppression comes with specific textual practices, right? Spreadsheets, Excel forms, again, CVs, the whole kind of range of documents that we are confronted with. Just think in terms of audit, which is basically a textual practice. So maybe the question is, what counts as language? Or what kind of language does this form of regulation and oppression come with? And under which condition? How is this language produced? By whom? How it is circulated and what effects does it have? I mean, of course, we, just because of our kind of disciplinary tradition, whatever that is, but we come with specific understandings of what language is, right? And with specific foci, right? But maybe for once, I mean, maybe what, you know, one way of answering this question is to turn around the question and say, I mean, how is governmentality done? And at what moment in history are these kind of understandings of language and how language serve the exertion, the doing of power? Is this, do we see transformations in that? Yeah, I mean, so for example, I mean, it's not for self-promotion, but I just thought a lot about how job counseling has changed in history, right? So for example, and it's interesting that this kind of transformations, there are a lot of continuities, but the transformations come with changing textual practices, right? From the doing of psychometric tests through a more interactional approach to a focus on narrative and storytelling, right? So it comes with different understanding of what counts as language and how language needs to be used to exert power and control and oppression, and then also for different types of people, right? But that then of course requires us to do what Joseph said before, right? Maybe also to kind of destabilize a little bit our understanding of what is language and where do we find language, right? And also to have this kind of also, I don't know, I mean, I'm talking to myself also, the openness, you know, to see and find language where I'm not used to find it, or the way I'm not kind of used to conceptualize it, if you want.
Thank you. Any other reactions, David, or?
I suppose in recent years, I mean, the whole thing about language is how important is language in all of this? And I'm not sure if Bonnie mentioned this at the very beginning, sort of hinted at it. I mean, is, you know, the whole, when we're talking about entire fields of research, you know, constructed around the centrality of language, if you like, but taking a more sort of, dare I say, Marxist perspective and going back to the basic political economy of the situation we live in on a very broad scale. I've sometimes wondered, and I've even written, although I think probably best ignored, that, you know, it's just kind of this thing about wagging the dog, you know, the tail wagging the dog, or are we looking at something through, I mean, if we are critiquing these uses of language, codified language in the university, what are we trying to do? Are we going to try to deconstruct and actually contest and take on global capitalism through this route? And if we are, how are we going to arrive at that point? Because if we take a kind of scalar approach to the world we live in, or structures, and we start at the very sort of, there are, you know, people don't like macro, meso, but I'll just say macro structures, you know, the economy, you know, like the world. And then you have all these intersecting elements, you know, politics, what's understood as a social culture and everything else. And then sort of, you know, going down to institutions and then more sociocultural formations. And we end up at some point, we keep going down the scales and we end up in an interaction like this one, you know, sort of very micro scale, if you like. So if we're dealing with language and we're working at the micro level, we're looking at sort of micro level interactions, and then we're kind of moving up a little bit into, we get to about institutions maybe. But my basic question is this going to really, you know, if what is our goal? And if the goal is to, you know, we would all like to see the disappearance of global capitalism as it's practiced today. What that would be replaced with, we could discuss. How do we get there? Now, maybe I'm just being ridiculous because I'm putting, you know, the objective at a level that obviously no single researcher, even group of researchers can take on. But I wonder where, you know, the really important issues that are going on might not have that much to do with language, or language is simply interconnected and even subsumed other things going on, a lot of other things going on. And then as we move upwards, as I said, we eventually get to basically the way the economy functions, and also the world, the political world, the social world, and how they function, right, at a very macro level. So that's kind of my 2 cents, really, because that's sort of the conclusion I've come to through my reading, you know, which very often is not in the realm of sociolinguistics. So yeah, that's a downer, I know, but you know, we can move on to something else. You did ask me, so.
Alfonso wants to react to that.
Yeah, I guess that this is gonna provoke other responses as well. But I just thought, I mean, I agree with David that, so it's as if, so maybe we need to go beyond and really think about, okay, so what are the alternatives and what can be done to kind of induce these alternatives, and of course we cannot do that as an individual. But I don't know. For once, I want to be more sociolinguist than I think I am. I think that when I'm stressing the importance to look at language, is not because I think that, okay, since I'm interested in language, let's look at language. I think it's through language that global capitalism is done, right? So looking at language is really looking at the making and perpetuation of these structures and regimes of oppression. And maybe I'm naive, but I think looking beyond capitalism will also require to look at language, okay? Because I don't know, if you look at, as David said, maybe we need to read outside of sociolinguistics also to get a bit of inspiration. But I mean, for example, there is this, one of these kind of thinkers that inspires me, like David Graeber, right? So in one of his pieces, a fragment of anarchist anthropology, he tries to kind of, think beyond, okay? But if you look at the examples that he makes, and then we can contest them and we can discuss them and problematize them. They are in a way all about language. They are in a way about how things are negotiated, how we get people to participate, how we can build other structures. So it's as if we cannot bypass so building a new system would require to think about how this system is done, put in place, perpetuated, circulated. And I cannot see how we can do that without thinking about practice and how this is constructed. So how is it done concretely? How is it practiced? And when we ask those questions, for me, we cannot not think about language, because as Joseph Park, I think was my understanding of what Joseph said before, we cannot think about practice without thinking about language.
Yeah, so if I can respond to that too, I think this is really a kind of fundamental question for, I guess, social linguists like us, linguistic anthropologists and social linguists like us who are kind of interested in these problems of capitalism, right? I mean, because of our nature of our specialization, we do want to really find some connection between language and what we want to critique, right? So that our expertise can have some purchase in that kind of critique, right? But that also kind of makes us wonder, does our desire to critique capitalism and neoliberalism based on our expertise, does that make us see a relevance of language when there isn't really any, right? So that's a kind of, I guess, a valid question that we need to be asking ourselves so that we don't really force our disciplinary kind of interest on the question that we want to explore, right? So yeah, so I guess David's work has been kind of actually kind of influential in my asking myself that question, right? But at the same time, kind of aligning with Alfonso, I do think language is important, and that in fact ties in with the question of what language really is, right? So if you're talking about language in a kind of more narrow way, for example, if language is specifically particular linguistic structures or sentences or words that we say or something like that, then yes, maybe that doesn't really have a key role in, I mean, it can be a resource that is being kind of picked up for capitalist interest in particular configurations and under neoliberalism, right? But beyond that, maybe that's not the main foundational thing that drives capitalism and neoliberalism, right? But at the same time, if we take a different perspective of language, and language that kind of not only is about that structural form, but if it's about social relationship itself, something that mediates social organization and social practice and social relations itself, language as practice, basically, right? As Alfonso said, then it becomes something indispensable, I guess, for any kind of material relation at the same time, right? So I guess I guess it really goes back to the question of how can we really define language and use that as a basis for our analytical perspective, right? Because that will determine whether we are able to find the correct kind of point of approach for this problem and to building a kind of a new kind of critique of capitalism and neoliberalism that can also lead us to kind of new perspectives as well. Yeah.
Okay, I see that, David, you want to react. Can we have a short reaction?
Very short, yeah, very short.
Thank you.
No, I just wanted to make clear, I'm not saying language is not important. It is important. It comes into everything every time I think about things. But, you know, going back to the notion of you know, how the practices of global capitalism, these are multi-leveled, obviously, but as much as would be the turning politics into a spectacle in a progressive number of countries, there's language and communication involved in that. So that's obviously a factor, but that is certainly something that's going on, and it's connected to global capitalism. To understand political economy, again, it's bringing in, it's about social relations, it's about power, it's about inequality, class, and above all, this kind of, you know, the production, distribution, and consumption of resources. So taking that definition of political economy, we have to consider all of these other things, but certainly the whole realm of linguistic anthropology and sociolinguistics comes into this very clearly. And despite what I said earlier, I mean, I end up touching on issues around language, whether it's doing discourse analysis or some other form. So I didn't mean to say that I didn't think language was important. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you for keeping it short. I'd like to end this debate by bringing another focus to the conversation. And this is something that has been mentioned already, so it's nothing new. I'd like for us to discuss critique. Okay, and this is something that Alfonso mentioned earlier. What do we make of our critical perspectives? And ethnography, what is the connection of ethnography to critique, and what's the value of ethnography in in and for critique. Maybe Bonnie, since you foreground the importance of ethnography in the chapter, maybe you want to address this.
Okay, sorry, I keep forgetting about the mute button. Just, I want to say regarding doing linguistic ethnography, and maybe link it back to that discussion we had earlier about what the hell is language anyway. I think ethnography is not simply, you know, going and interacting with people and having them answer questions and stuff. It's a cumulative process of trying to recognize what those people were working with, what they recognize as socially real, whether you're working with you know, actual human beings interacting, I'm trying to avoid the term individuals, or whether you're working with corporate entities that somehow have developed hyper-personhood. And that includes higher education, as well as other. But I think that it's really, you know, doing ethnography well is really a cumulative process. And it means sensitizing yourself to what you can't recognize. And I think, to go back to the discussion we had earlier about what the hell is language, it means going in with the recognition that, you know, by training and inclination, there's only certain processes or forms or practices that we offhand do recognize as language, but staying open to the possibility that there's dimensions that are part of this thing called language that we don't have well formulated. That's why I told that story that Pedro told me 30 years ago, you know, about, well, you know, these people might recognize tone, but, you know, we can't quantify it. So it's not part of our description of language. Well, shit, it's part of everybody's everyday reality. And it's even more important than a lot of formal stuff. So, you know, I think what ethnography should sensitize us to do is to keep sort of unfolding what we can recognize as knowable or unknowable. But anyway, sorry, it's about as best I can do offhand. Anybody else? Anybody want to add anything?
I guess to just say something briefly. I mean, I totally agree with what Bonnie said. And I guess in context of neoliberalism, right, where there's kind of more intensified inequality and I guess not just inequality in terms of the, you know, the quantifiable difference in, you know, income or those kind of things, but also how there's a lot of frustration and desperation and, you know, pain going on because of this. I guess inequality always brings those things, right? But somehow I feel that kind of the period that we're living in, somehow that's kind of more intensified, right? I mean, that really kind of requires, I guess, a more ethnographic perspective to really properly understand, right? So what are the kind of affects and the desires and the, you know, moral kind of tensions that people experience as they kind of are put through this kind of neoliberal structure and as they engage with these neoliberal subjectivities that they're supposed to take on and what they feel as they try to disengage with that, for example, as well, right? Those kind of things are something that does need to be kind of the lens of ethnography to properly account for, I would say, right? So I guess like I feel like I keep kind of praising other panelists' work here, but for example, Alfonso's work, indeed that's recently carrying on, seems to be a very good example of that to me, which kind of talks about the very account of the people who need to struggle through this kind of neoliberal system that they're experiencing, right? So I think it's, in that sense, critical perspective in the ethnography particularly goes together particularly strongly in this kind of neoliberal context. Yeah.
I think it's Alfonso first, but correct me if I'm mistaken. I think
No, it was
Alfonso,
David.
you go in first.
David was
Oh,
first.
was it?
Sorry, David.
Okay, David, sorry.
Yeah, that's the second time I've got it.
Sorry.
No, you asked about ethnography, and I wanted to plug a book, which is actually Bonnie's book that she mentioned, Experiencing Prejudice, because one thing I think about ethnography, I'm not a good ethnographer, but I enjoy reading good ethnography, and I, looking back at Shirley Bryce Heath, some of the earlier works in sort of foundational literacy studies and sociolinguistics, and Monica Heller's work, and Penelope Eckert. And what I loved about those books is you had a whole story. They were cinematic. You were brought into, like in Monica's case, you're brought into a secondary school in Canada, a bilingual school, and it just comes to life. And I always love that. And this book by Bonnie, which I can't remember, was it 1988? Was it? I read it really only about 6 or 7 years ago. But what struck me was,
96.
Sorry.
In 1996, it came out.
Oh God! I thought it was right. Okay, I got it wrong. But anyway, yeah, okay. But
the field work was 1988. Sorry.
What I like about ethnography like that is like there's other stuff going on, or you can read it in a different way. As I said, it could be seen as cinematic, and I was very interested in the book from 1996 by Bonnie because it does intersectionality in a very effective way without mentioning I don't think you mentioned the term intersectionality, I can't remember, or if you like the Patricia Hill Collins and the matrix of domination, because you have issues around race, gender, and class coming in very clearly, as well as other modes of oppression. And so the ethnography, while it's about one thing, could also be seen as being about another thing. And that's my take on ethnography. I can't speak from, I've done ethnographically oriented work, I would say, but not true ethnographies. So I'll have to, it's one thing I'll probably never do in my life. But anyway.
Alfonso.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about the question of critique, right? And its intersection with ethnography. And just for me, it's a bit linked to what I said before. I think that, so I'm not a very good theoretician, right? And but what interests, so we know, neoliberalism, neoliberal governmentality, like other kind of cultural formations that are oppressive, they stick not because everybody loses, but because some win, right? So this is why they are so powerful, right? So I do think that ethnography really allows us to really better understand who benefits and who loses in the everyday. So it allows us to get close to that and really to understand the effects. I mean, how this management of inequality has a specific effect for certain people and not for others. Mm-hmm. And it's there, it's this what interests me. So it's not an abstract critique of neoliberalism, but rather a really kind of understanding of its effects on different people. And then I think this has implications for me personally as somebody participating in this system. I mean, we are all part of this as individuals, right? I mean, now we all in a way or another members of universities. We are actors, these agents. We take decisions. We reproduce certain logics that we contest. So that, for me, I mean, the critique is there. It's understanding its effects on social inequality, and then trying to also situate myself in this, right? So how do I contribute to the reproduction of this thing? Okay, so just a little example to be a bit provocative. I mean, the first meeting of this seminar series, we decided to postpone it because my colleagues in the UK were on strike. There was a bit of an outrage on social media. We understood this event as a kind of response, as making education, but obviously and legitimately, some of my colleagues were outraged. Now today, the other workers in my universities are on strike. I mean, the cleaners, the people in the kitchen, the porters, the security worker, and I'm not seeing any of this outrage, right? So the question for me is, what do we do with this critique that we are making? And in whose service? So whose struggle are we supporting, right? So for me, this is important. It's the next step. So since we are all agents of this, and since we contribute to the reproduction of this, how can we learn from what we document? And how can we imagine in our own way other sorts of practices? And then how can we do this as a group? And how can we encourage our colleagues to do this? How can we learn so from what we document? Also knowing that, by the way, neoliberalism is very much interested in our critique of racism and of forms of speech and of inequality. And yeah, okay.
Thank you, Alfonso. One of our constraints is time, and I need to pass the floor on to Luisa, and maybe we can answer, or we can come back to some of these comments in the third session of this series, and we can establish the link then between the second and the third session that way. So as I said, now I have to pass the floor on to Luisa so that she can comment on the comments that were posted on the chat, and maybe you can engage with some of them. So Luisa.
So I'll try to summarize, because there are many questions, very, very interesting questions. I think I see three main topics in these comments. The first one is that capitalism seems to need to produce different rationalities to govern societies and to justify these inequalities in society. So, for instance, coloniality, now neoliberal governmentality, and so on. So shall we develop a genealogical approach to study the evolution of capitalism and at the same time the production of these rationalities, these political rationalities? That was one of the topics I see, summarizing. The second one is in relation to our methodology. Can we study this bunch of skills and these programs without framing our research in a broader research about the role of universities in the economic system and on the governmental system or governmental rationality? So can we study one thing without the other? And there is another question that I think is that an appeal to, there is hope in some way, because we cannot size the effects of these programs, because different participants highlight that the students, for instance, can pantomime different reactions. Also, maybe they don't feel empowered to criticize publicly these programs, but maybe they do in another places. Or maybe they cannot show discomfort, but they have discomfort. So there is not always there is not always acceptance, if you want. And finally, there is a reflection about the lack of impact, because we think, all of you, we have highlighted that the language is something very relevant in all these processes. However, one of the participants highlight that our research is not having impact in sociology, in anthropology, and in other fields. So this research showing how language is important. So what can we do in this direction? So I'm going to give the floor to all the participants, all the speakers in alphabetical order. Maybe you can choose one of these questions, because otherwise we start again the session. So thank you. David is the first one, then Alfonso, then Joseph, and finally Bonnie.
David, you are unmuted. You're muted, sorry.
Sorry. No, impact, I'll just comment very briefly on impact, since that was, Luisa mentioned that towards the end. And there was a comment earlier about that, mentioning the way that a lot of people, if you look at the social sciences in general, do they cite, do they actually refer to work going on in linguistic anthropology and sociolinguistics, which is, at least on the surface and even actually quite in detail, dealing with the same topics. They're discussing neoliberal economics and the consequences for society, and so are the linguistic anthropologists and sociolinguists. And I've always been struck by that. And so in a way, from sociolinguistics and linguistics, people go into these fields and cite some scholars, but there's not a kind of two-way traffic. And I do have the impression sometimes, I read something written by a sociologist where they enter the realm of language, a certain naivete about how language and communication function, because I've been exposed to probably quite a few studies in that realm. But still, this is a kind of it's not a question, but it's an issue, about this sort of reciprocity, if you like, the sort of two-way traffic that never really seems to take off. And very often, when I'm looking at a book that's more mainstream sociology, I look in the references and see if they've cited anybody, that I know, or let alone myself. But forget that. Just say I'm looking to see if other people have been cited. Is Ben Rampton there, or Monica Heller, or something like that. So I think I'll just mention that. I mean, again, I'm just throwing that out, and that's like an ongoing. That's another topic we could spend 2 hours talking about. But anyway, that's what I would comment on.
Yeah, so maybe briefly on this, and then on another question as well. I mean, of course, we all have this feeling that we have no kind of impact. At the same time, I'm seeing a lot of Urciuoli cited in other work outside of the language studies. I see a lot of Ilana Bershon cited, especially when it comes to this topic here. Certain types of studies, of course, not in all studies. There is a so-called linguistic term in the social sciences that is very present. That does not mean that we are cited in that, right? So maybe the problem is also that we don't engage actively. We don't publish in these journals. We don't go to these conferences. We don't, I'm not sure. I'm sure that many of you are. so it's always a two-way process as well, right? So how are we engaging with the other social sciences? Often also we don't understand ourselves as a social science, by the way. Yeah, so this is the first thing. The other thing about, you know, the interconnection between this sort of kind of workshops and these neoliberal registers with a kind of larger higher education and education industry. I think that we must make these links, and we constantly, I mean, I do think that we constantly must make these links, you know, scaling up and scaling down, trying to make links with things that we supposedly find unimportant, right? So, I mean, we don't want to be this kind of old-fashioned Wallersteinian, we don't want to be in that kind of world system theory, but I do think that things are connected. I think also, especially those of us who do ethnography, I think we need to force ourselves to zoom out of the situation and really try to make links and ask ourselves, where is this coming from? How is this connected to what's happening in other places? Yeah, yeah, and so I think we should really do this.
So if I can comment, I think it was a third kind of question about kind of hope, if I understand the question correctly. So can we see kind of a hope and kind of a possibility of change through all this? I mean, in my opening comments, I talked about briefly about, you know, how we might see such neoliberal regimes potentially leaking, and whether those moments of leakage could be considered kind of moments of contestation or resistance or refusal. I mean, I guess that's a big question, so I don't really have a quite straightforward answer to that, but I guess obviously we would assume that not all spaces of leakage itself would necessarily be something that leads to social transformation against neoliberal capitalism, right? So I guess that's one point where some critical reflection, not just for academics, but people who are on the ground, where kind of more critical consciousness needs to be kind of brought up to reflect on what those moments of kind of you know, leakage, what's happening when we find ourselves in those moments of leakage, right? So first of all, I mean, we might not, as just ordinary people ourselves, we might not always notice that we are at a particular moment where we see this kind of contradiction between what neoliberalism says we should be doing versus what we are actually doing, right? For example, kind of having more awareness of those kind of thoughts, those moments, it can be one way of kind of highlighting those spaces as potential places of contestation or challenge and transformation or refusal. And to tie this with the idea of impact, I guess impact should not necessarily just be measured in terms of our academic impact, right? Or citation of our own work. Well, that is also important, and we should strive to do that. But at the same time, how are we reaching out towards the more general kind of audience beyond academia, kind of disseminating our insights and findings in a way that really makes an impact in society as well, right? So, and there are many people doing that by publishing their own work in more accessible formats and blogs or various other mediums. And that's very important work that is being done, I think, to make an impact. And that could potentially be kind of more extended in solidarity with other sections of social movements throughout the world to kind of have some impact that matters beyond just our academic field, I guess.
Shall I? To pick up on that, what Joseph just said, one thing we probably want to remember is we've all been editors or have done edited volumes or have edited manuscripts or done something kind of gatekeeping. And it's ironic, and it's a situation we find ourselves in, and it's not really easy to deal with this, but we find ourselves having to make editorial decisions about not only our own, but other people's work. Does it fit this venue that asked me to review it? Or if you've edited a journal, you know, how do I decide what fits into this journal? And of course, I'm saying this because we're all part of this sort of knowledge production system that is defined by a certain capitalism of how journals work. And, I don't, it's hard to fight, and it's important to try to fight it at the same time that you have to do it. And I don't have an answer to that. Can I, and response to a comment that just popped up, we do need more public intellectuals, but perhaps not public intellectuals that are sitting around going, I'm a public intellectual, but rather I'm addressing something. Louisa, were there other comments that you made that we haven't covered that you'd like us to address before we conclude? I should have written them down and I can't remember them.
They are, but because they are very complex questions there.
Okay.
So I think we don't have time to address all these. Maybe they are issues for our next discussion, because it's the role of colonialism and coloniality in the production of one rationality that justify or reinforce capitalism, and then now with a new form of capitalism, neoliberalism, neoliberal rationality. And then in this context, shall we do a genealogical research studying the evolution of capitalism in relation to the production of these new rationalities, and then these new political rationalities? This is one of the questions but there are many, and they are all in this line.
Yeah.
Broad questions. If you want to say something to close about this, would be nice if you.
Would Laura or Luisa, I scribbled down answers to some of the chat questions that you forwarded me yesterday. Do you want me to take 5 minutes to answer them? Okay. So the first question was, and I'll try to summarize that several of the book's chapters showed different degrees of investment among people targeted to shape their conduct and subjectivity. These different degrees of investment can be influenced by different factors. How might we explain those differences? Quickly, I would say a critical factor is how people are imagined in terms of the labor market. So there we go. The lower the status, the greater discipline. And basically what we're looking at is a current version of a much older principle. Maybe what's different about neoliberalism is how much actual specific individuals are expected or encouraged to internalize. The next question was in relation to this chapter and the one we read last time, which was Luisa's, where is language in all this? We've been talking about that at some length. And, again, what gets recognized as language is a function of conditions governing how people formulate language, which is a function of how they get authorized to do so. Third question I got, it seems striking how little the leadership programs I described apply neoliberal core principles. No kidding. Is there a logic behind the programs? They seem to reproduce an ideology of skills and point to shoving students to, toward a certain subjectivity, yet since they're part of formalization, they're part of mechanisms to discipline future workers. Actually, my answer is, and it took me until well after I published, after the book came out, 3 years ago, the message sent by these programs is we produce these students, whether they actually produce them or not. I'm not sure what they think they're doing sometimes, but the programs project a marketing message or brand, and they get donations, as do the schools. So they're using students as basically actors in their ads. And that's why I keep talking about it as neoliberal theater. Maybe neoliberalism in US private education is especially concerned with branding. There might be a peculiarly US twist in this. And then the last question, let's see. The sender says, I appreciate that the author addresses, I'm interested in the concept of pseudo-register. It seems that Percio and Ashoka are less true communities of practice, but rather there is no expert present or the expert is uninvolved in the training. Yeah, that is the damn truth. The novices outnumber the experts. So what's the interaction between Percio and Ashoka and the learning by doing programs that colleges and universities sponsor themselves? I would answer by saying, I think Percio and Ashoka are less communities of practice than they are theater. So again, they play out scripts that show how entrepreneurial and neoliberally inculcating they are. I don't think they actually interact much with programs that colleges and universities themselves produce, which is described in the article. I think that a lot of those university-specific programs would like to see themselves as communities of practice, but that is not why they exist. They exist, and I'm convinced of this, so that donors will write checks to the universities. So again, pseudo-register is part of a larger theater of neoliberalism that produces the good student. And I will conclude that by saying the more I think about this, the more I see a relationship between how this works and the business plan behind social media, which is about projecting the idea of someone posting on social media as a certain kind of person. And they, Facebook doesn't give a rat's ass what we think. What they want is the information they harvest from this that they can make money off of somehow. So I think, when we think about how corporations are starting to operate as hyper people in a neoliberal order, I think that's one of the things we want to think about. Okay, I'm done.
Thank
Well, thanks a lot, Bonnie, for that final thought. A huge thanks to all our guest speakers, and also to the participants in these, the attendees using the chat register, the Zoom register. I would like to remind you that there is a final session on June the 9th, and this is actually the first session that was postponed, as Alfonso was saying. So June the 9th from 5 to 7 Central European Time on the topic of capitalism and neoliberalism. So I hope you all found the debate as inspiring and as illuminating as I found it. And we look forward to seeing you all on June the 9th. Bye-bye then. Thank you.
Thank you.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you all. It's been fantastic sharing this debate with you all.
Thank you all. It was great.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, thanks, Alfonso.
Thank you, Eva, for doing this.
Thanks.
Yeah, you did very well, Eva. You were confident.
I was so nervous.
Too many.
Oh gosh, I think